Velociraptor begs Triceratops for help, then does something so amazing it changes everything. How will this heartwarming story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The prehistoric jungle was alive with sound. The distant calls of pterosaurs echoed through the misty canopy, and the occasional thundering footsteps of massive sauropods shook the ground. Ferns and thick vines covered the forest floor, twisting like green serpents around the trunks of towering trees. Sunlight filtered down in broken patches, painting the world in a golden glow. But beneath the peaceful facade, the jungle was a dangerous place. A world of predators and prey, where survival was the only law that mattered. Rin knew this all too well. The young Velociraptor stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His usually sleek, agile form was marred by injuries, deep gashes along his flank and a painful limp in his right leg. Each step sent sharp jolts of pain through his body, but he couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. His sharp, yellow eyes darted around the dense jungle, searching for threats. Rin had been part of a pack once, a group of swift, clever hunters who worked together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. But something had gone terribly wrong. A hunt had turned into an ambush, and in the chaos, Rin had been separated. Injured and alone, he'd been forced to flee deeper into unfamiliar territory. Now, every step was a fight to keep going. Rin paused for a moment, his sides heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His keen senses picked up the sounds of the jungle around him. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, the faint splash of water nearby. He craned his neck, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of something large. His heart pounded. Something's here. Slowly, Rin pushed his way through the underbrush, wincing as branches scraped against his wounds. He reached the edge of a small clearing and froze, his eyes widening. Standing in the middle of the clearing was a Triceratops. Rin had seen Triceratops before, but never this close. She was massive, her thick, muscular body covered in rough, textured skin that glistened slightly in the sunlight. Her horns, sharp and gleaming, curved out like deadly spears from her head, framing the broad, bony frill that protected her neck. She stood near a large tree, tearing at the low-hanging branches with slow, deliberate movements. Her deep brown eyes were calm but watchful, her every motion a reminder of her immense strength. Rin's instinct screamed at him to retreat. Triceratops were herbivores, yes, but they were also fierce when threatened. He had seen one of his packmates get gored by a Triceratops's horns once, the massive creature defending her young with terrifying force. Rin, weak and injured as he was, wouldn't stand a chance if she decided to charge. And yet, Rin didn't move. He could feel the exhaustion in his bones, the hunger gnawing at his belly like a fire that wouldn't go out. He couldn't hunt like this, couldn't even stand for much longer without collapsing. The thought of finding food or safety on his own felt impossible. Desperation flickered in Rin's yellow eyes as he watched the Triceratops. He had no idea why, but something told him to stay, to try, even though it made no sense. Slowly, Rin stepped into the clearing. The Triceratops, Thora, stopped chewing. Her massive head lifted, her dark eyes locking onto Rin with an intensity that made his breath catch. She snorted loudly, a warning that echoed through the clearing. Dust sprayed from her nostrils as her massive feet dug into the earth, her muscles tensing as she lowered her horns. Rin froze, his injured leg trembling beneath him. He knew what this posture meant. Stay back. But he didn't. Instead, Rin let out a soft, warbling sound, a strange, high-pitched vocalization that his kind used to communicate submission. He lowered his body to the ground as best as he could, his head ducking low in a gesture of vulnerability. Thora's eyes narrowed. She snorted again, shifting her weight as though ready to charge. But something about Rin's posture made her pause. She had seen predators before, cunning creatures that lurked at the edges of her herd, waiting for an opportunity to strike. But this was different. The Velociraptor didn't look like a threat. He looked broken. Rin let out another soft call, his voice quivering slightly as he tried to hold the submissive posture. His body trembled from the effort, his injuries screaming in protest. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the faint chirp of insects. Then, slowly, Thora lifted her head. She didn't relax completely. Her horns remained lowered slightly, ready to defend herself if necessary, but the tension in her muscles eased. She tilted her head, her massive frill catching the light as she regarded Rin with something that almost resembled curiosity. Rin held his breath, his yellow eyes wide as he watched her. Thora let out a low, rumbling sound, a deep, guttural noise that vibrated through the air. It wasn't quite a warning, but it wasn't a welcome either. It was something in between, a question perhaps or a challenge. Rin answered with another soft, pleading call, his head lowering even further to the ground. Thora watched him for a long, tense moment before she stepped back. Her horns lifted slightly, and she turned her head, resuming her slow, deliberate chewing of the tree's branches. Rin let out a shaky breath, his body sagging with relief. She hadn't attacked, but he knew this was only the beginning. For the rest of the day, Rin stayed on the far edge of the clearing, never venturing too close to Thora. He curled himself into a small ball of feathers and scales beneath the shade of a broad fern. His injured leg stretched awkwardly to the side. His body screamed for rest, but his mind remained alert, watching the Triceratops' every move. Thora didn't seem to mind his presence, though she occasionally cast a watchful eye in his direction. Her massive form moved slowly through the clearing as she grazed, tearing at leaves and ferns with powerful bites. She was calm, deliberate, and utterly unbothered by the chaos of the world around her. To Rin, she felt like a force of nature, unshakable, unstoppable. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, Rin's stomach growled painfully. He had gone too long without food. His instincts urged him to hunt, but he knew he couldn't. Not like this. He glanced toward Thora, watching as she pulled down another branch with a single powerful tug. Rin didn't understand why she hadn't chased him off yet. It made no sense for a creature like her to tolerate his presence. They were supposed to be enemies, predator and prey, locked in a never-ending dance of survival. And yet, here they were. As night fell, Rin curled tighter beneath the fern, his yellow eyes heavy with exhaustion. Thora moved closer to the center of the clearing, settling herself near the base of the tree. She let out a low, rumbling breath as her massive body sank into the grass. For a long moment, the clearing was silent. Then, Thora let out a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like a purr, but deeper. It was a sound of calm, of safety. Rin's eyes fluttered closed as the sound washed over him, his body relaxing for the first time in days. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The first rays of dawn filtered through the dense canopy, spreading soft gold across the clearing. Birds called out from their perches high above, and the steady hum of insects filled the quiet air. Rin stirred beneath the fern, his muscles stiff from the night before. His sharp yellow eyes blinked open, immediately scanning the clearing for signs of danger. And there she was. Thora stood in the same spot where she had settled the night before, her massive form bathed in the morning light. She seemed at peace, tearing lazily at the dewy ferns that grew at the clearing's edge. For a moment, Rin simply watched her. Her sheer size and power were awe-inspiring, a reminder of how fragile he was by comparison. The aching hunger gnawed at Rin's stomach, and he knew he couldn't ignore it much longer. If he didn't eat soon, his weakened body wouldn't last another day. Carefully, Rin stretched his injured leg, wincing at the pain that flared up his side. The gash along his flank throbbed dully, but he could tell it was healing slowly, but healing nonetheless. He could move even if it was awkward and painful. That was something. Pushing himself to his feet, Rin glanced warily at Thora. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, her horns lowering just slightly, but she didn't move to charge. Rin hesitated, then let out a soft chirp, more out of habit than anything else. Thora snorted in response, shaking her head as though dismissing him. Rin's stomach growled again, louder this time, and he turned his head toward the jungle. There had to be something he could hunt, something small and weak enough for him to catch. The problem was, Rin wasn't the predator he had once been. He had been fast, cunning, and precise in his movements before the injury. Now, his speed was gone, his balance shaky at best. The thought of chasing anything felt impossible, but hunger left him no choice. Rin took a hesitant step toward the tree-line, his claws digging into the earth. He would try. Hours passed, and Rin's efforts bore no fruit. He had managed to stumble upon a family of small prehistoric mammals, quick little creatures that darted between the ferns like shadows. Rin had crept as close as he dared, his heart pounding with anticipation. But when he finally lunged, the pain in his leg had slowed him down. The animals scattered instantly, disappearing into burrows and thickets before Rin even touched the ground. Frustrated and exhausted, Rin slumped beneath the shade of a massive tree, his chest heaving. His body was growing weaker by the hour, and every failed attempt left him more discouraged. He tilted his head back, letting out a low, warbling cry that echoed faintly through the forest. He didn't expect anyone to hear it, but someone did. From the clearing behind him, there was a rustling sound, loud, steady, and unmistakable. Rin froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned his head sharply, his eyes widening as he watched Thora step through the underbrush. She moved toward him with deliberate, thunderous steps, the ground trembling slightly beneath her weight. Ferns and small branches snapped under her massive feet, and for a brief moment, Rin wondered if she had finally decided to finish him off. But then Thora stopped a few feet away from him, her dark eyes locked onto his. She let out a low, rumbling sound, one that carried neither anger nor threat. Instead, it was something else. Question, perhaps. Rin stared up at her, too tired and weak to move. Thora snorted softly, lowering her massive head toward the ground. Rin watched, bewildered, as she used her horns to pull up a thick clump of plants and roots. She nudged them toward him, the greenery landing in a small pile at his feet. Rin blinked, stunned. She's offering it to me? Thora snorted again, her breath stirring the plants as she watched him expectantly. Rin hesitated, his instincts warring with his exhaustion. Velociraptors didn't eat plants. They were hunters, predators. Meat had always been his food, and yet, Rin's body was screaming for sustenance. Anything that could keep him alive a little longer. Slowly, cautiously, Rin lowered his head and sniffed the clump of plants. They smelled fresh, covered in morning dew. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was what he needed. With a faint chirp of surrender, Rin tore off a small piece and chewed it. The taste was strange, bitter but not unpleasant. He swallowed it down, glancing up at Thora as if to ask, "What now?" Thora huffed softly, as though satisfied, and began to tear up another patch of ferns. Rin watched her for a moment, something strange stirring inside him. She was helping him. Why? It made no sense. Triceratops and Velociraptors were not allies. Thora had every reason to chase him off. Yet here she was, sharing her food with a creature that might one day grow strong enough to threaten her. Rin let out a faint chirp of gratitude before tearing off another bite. The food eased the gnawing hunger, filling him with enough strength to hold his head higher. Thora continued to graze nearby, keeping one watchful eye on the jungle as though guarding him. It was an unspoken agreement, one neither of them fully understood, but both of them accepted. Over the next few days, Rin began to recover. The food Thora shared with him gave him just enough energy to move without collapsing. His wounds were healing faster now, the deep gash along his flank scabbing over and the pain in his leg easing with every step. Rin still couldn't hunt, but Thora's strange generosity kept him alive. Each day, she would nudge ferns and plants toward him, huffing impatiently whenever he hesitated to eat. Rin had grown used to the taste now, though he still longed for meat. In return, Rin stayed close to the clearing. He no longer hid at its edges. Instead, he rested in the open, often near Thora's massive feet. She didn't seem to mind his presence anymore. If anything, she appeared to tolerate him, perhaps even trust him in her own way. It was a delicate balance, one that neither of them dared to break. Rin soon discovered something else about Thora. She wasn't just strong, she was wise. The way she moved, the way she reacted to the sounds of the jungle, it was as though she could sense danger long before it arrived. Rin learned to watch her, to pay attention to the signals she gave. If Thora lifted her head suddenly, Rin would do the same, his eyes scanning the trees for threats. If she huffed or snorted, he knew to stay still, to wait and listen. It was like having a guide, a protector, something Rin had never thought he would find in a creature so different from himself. And slowly, without realizing it, Rin began to feel stronger. His limp was still there, but his movements were quicker now, his balance more sure. His eyes regained their sharp focus, and his claws flexed with newfound strength. He was healing, and he owed it all to Thora. One evening, as the sun set behind the treetops, Rin perched on a low branch overlooking the clearing. Thora grazed nearby, her massive silhouette framed against the golden sky. Rin watched her, his yellow eyes thoughtful. Something had changed in him. Before the injury, Rin's life had been simple: hunt, survive, repeat. His pack had been everything to him, and the bond they shared had been based on strength, strategy, and survival. But Thora had shown him something different, something he couldn't quite explain. It was trust, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. Rin chirped softly, drawing Thora's attention. She lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, predator and prey, brought together by fate and circumstance. Rin let out a faint, contented trill before settling back onto the branch. Thora snorted softly in response, as though acknowledging the bond they now shared. Whatever this was, Rin knew it couldn't last forever. The jungle was still a dangerous place, and survival was still the only law that mattered. But for now, they had each other. And for Rin, that was enough. The forest grew darker as twilight fell, the once vibrant greens of the jungle fading into deep blues and shadows. The evening chorus of birds and insects began to quiet, replaced by a more ominous stillness. Rin sat perched on a fallen log, his sharp yellow eyes scanning the treeline as the hairs along his spine prickled. Something felt off. Thora was nearby, standing with her head lowered as she grazed lazily. She seemed calm, unaware, or perhaps unbothered by the unease that had settled in Rin's chest. But Rin's instincts were sharp, honed over years of surviving in the jungle, and he had learned to trust them. A faint rustling sound broke through the quiet. Rin's head snapped toward it, his gaze narrowing. The sound was subtle, too subtle. It wasn't the careless noise of herbivores grazing or small mammals scampering through the brush. No, this was deliberate, calculated. Rin froze, his breath shallow as his eyes darted across the shadows, searching. Then he saw it, a flash of movement, a tail disappearing behind a tree. Predators. His heart began to pound in his chest. The jungle was full of dangers, but Rin knew exactly what kind of creature moved like that. Other raptors. Pack. Rin had been part of a pack once, and he knew how they hunted. Swift, silent, coordinated. They would circle their prey, driving it into an ambush where escape became impossible. His gaze flickered toward Thora, still oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. She had no idea what was coming. Rin let out a sharp warning trill, the sound cutting through the stillness. Thora lifted her head abruptly, her dark eyes snapping to him in confusion. Rin's body was tense, his tail lashing behind him as he turned his head toward the trees. Listen, he thought desperately. Trust me. Thora snorted, stomping one of her massive feet as though questioning his strange behavior. But Rin didn't have time to explain. He took a step back, his sharp eyes locked on the darkening jungle as the rustling grew louder. Suddenly, a guttural screech echoed through the clearing, followed by the snapping of branches. Rin's blood turned to ice. Out of the shadows emerged two velociraptors, their sleek bodies moving like living shadows through the underbrush. Their eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, and their razor-sharp claws dug into the earth with each step. They were larger than Rin, older, stronger. Rin let out another sharp call, this one louder, more urgent. He was trying to warn Thora, trying to tell her to move, to run. But Thora remained where she was, her massive body tense and her horns lowered as she watched the raptors with a mix of confusion and fury. The two raptors hissed, their heads darting toward Thora as they spread out, circling her. Rin knew their tactics. They were testing her, looking for weaknesses, preparing to strike. Thora might have been strong, but against two coordinated predators, even a Triceratops could be brought down. Rin's instincts screamed at him to run. He was smaller, weaker, and still healing. If he stayed, he risked his life. But as he watched the raptors move closer to Thora, something held him back. She had saved him. She had fed him, protected him, given him the strength to recover when no one else would have. And now, as the raptors prepared to attack, Rin knew he couldn't abandon her. He let out a low growl, his body coiling with tension as his claws flexed against the earth. They don't know I'm here, he thought. I can use that. The first raptor lunged, darting toward Thora's flank with terrifying speed. Thora roared, her horns slashing through the air as she turned to meet the attack. The second raptor moved in at the same time, aiming for her exposed side. Rin didn't think. He moved. With a burst of speed that sent pain lancing up his injured leg, Rin leapt from the log and crashed into the second raptor's side. His claws dug into its back, and his teeth snapped at its neck. The larger raptor screeched in surprise, thrashing violently as it tried to shake him off. Move, Thora! Rin let out a shrill, desperate call. Thora, finally understanding the danger, bellowed and charged forward, her massive horns sweeping through the air. The first raptor leapt back just in time, narrowly avoiding being gored. Thora's charge sent dust and leaves flying, her power shaking the very ground beneath them. Rin clung to the second raptor, his teeth sinking into its shoulder as it screeched and rolled. The pain in his leg was agonizing, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. The raptor slammed him against a tree trunk, knocking the wind from Rin's lungs and sending him sprawling onto the ground. Dazed, Rin scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming as he tried to focus. The two raptors regrouped, their hisses echoing through the clearing as they turned their attention back to Thora. She stood her ground, her horns lowered and her deep, guttural growls rumbling through the air. Rin knew they couldn't hold out forever. Thora was strong, but she was outnumbered. And Rin, small, injured Rin, was no match for raptors twice his size. But he couldn't give up. He let out a sharp, piercing cry, a call of defiance that echoed through the trees. The raptors turned to him, their eyes narrowing. Rin darted forward, his movements shaky but determined. He darted left, then right, his small size allowing him to weave through the underbrush like a shadow. He snapped his jaws at the nearest raptor, drawing its attention and forcing it to turn toward him. Thora seized the opportunity. With a deafening roar, she charged. Her massive body moved like a battering ram, her horns slicing through the air as she slammed into the distracted raptor. The impact sent the predator sprawling across the ground, a pained screech tearing from its throat. The second raptor turned toward Thora, screeching in fury. Rin saw his chance. He darted behind it, leaping onto its back and sinking his claws into its flesh. The raptor thrashed, but Rin held on, snapping his jaws and forcing it to stumble. Thora spun, her horns glinting in the dim light as she lunged toward the second raptor. Rin leapt off just in time, landing awkwardly as Thora's horns struck true. The predator let out one final screech before collapsing to the ground. For a moment, the clearing was silent. The first raptor, still recovering from Thora's charge, let out a hiss of frustration. It glanced between Thora and Rin, its sharp eyes calculating. Then, with a final growl, it turned and bolted back into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows. Rin collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. Pain radiated from his leg and his wounds, but he didn't care. They had won. Thora stood nearby, her massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. She let out a low, rumbling breath as she turned to look at Rin, her dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or respect. Rin blinked up at her, too exhausted to move. He let out a faint chirp, soft, weary, but triumphant. Thora snorted, stepping closer. To Rin's surprise, she lowered her massive head, her frill just inches away from him. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, predator and prey, allies in a world that made no sense. Then, gently, Thora nudged Rin's side with her horn. It wasn't a shove or a warning. It was reassurance. Rin's yellow eyes softened, and he let out a quiet, contented trill. He didn't understand how it had happened, how two creatures who were supposed to be enemies had fought side by side and saved one another. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had survived, and together they had changed everything. The forest remained eerily still after the battle. The once chaotic clearing was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of distant birds. Rin lay where he had fallen, his sides heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The pain in his leg flared with every beat of his heart, but it no longer mattered. They had survived. Thora stood nearby, her massive form casting a shadow over him as she watched him carefully. Her horns were stained with dirt and the faint traces of blood from the fight, and her breathing was heavy from the effort she had exerted. Yet despite the exhaustion in her eyes, there was a calmness about her, a quiet strength that filled the clearing like a warm breeze. Rin blinked up at her, his vision still hazy from the battle. He had never been so close to a creature like her before, so close to something so powerful and yet so gentle. Thora lowered her head slightly, her massive frill tilting forward as she nudged him again, this time more softly, as if asking, "Are you still alive, little one?" Rin let out a faint, reassuring chirp. He wasn't sure how he was still moving, but somehow he was. Thora seemed satisfied with his response. She snorted softly, a deep rumble that carried through the clearing, before stepping back and settling onto the ground. Her massive body sank into the dirt with a thud, and for the first time, Rin noticed the scratches and bruises along her thick hide. "She's hurt too," he thought, his sharp yellow eyes softening. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply existed together, sharing the quiet aftermath of the fight. The jungle around them remained wary, as though holding its breath after the violence it had just witnessed. Rin shifted slightly, testing his injured leg. The pain was still there, but it was manageable. He let out a low chirp, more of a sigh than anything else, before curling up where he lay. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rin allowed himself to rest. When Rin woke again, the clearing was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, its warm glow filtering through the leaves and painting the forest in shades of gold and green. Rin's body still ached, but the sharp edge of the pain had dulled to a manageable throb. Thora was still there. She stood at the far end of the clearing, her massive head lowered as she tore at the leaves of a low-hanging branch. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she too was feeling the strain of the fight. Rin watched her for a long moment, something strange stirring in his chest. Why didn't she run? He wondered. Why did she fight for me? Thora was powerful, strong enough to take care of herself without his help. She could have easily left him behind and escaped the raptors, yet she hadn't. She had stayed, fought, and defended him as though he were her own. The thought unsettled him. Predators and prey didn't help each other. Not in this world, where survival was all that mattered. And yet, Rin couldn't deny what had happened. Thora had saved him, just as he had tried to save her. For the first time in his life, Rin felt something he didn't have a name for. Gratitude. Slowly, Rin pushed himself to his feet. His body protested the movement, but he ignored it, his sharp claws digging into the dirt for balance. He took a step forward, then another until he was standing at the edge of the clearing. Thora lifted her head at the sound of his approach, her dark eyes watching him closely. Her horns lowered slightly, a natural reflex, but there was no aggression in her posture. Rin paused, chirping softly as though to say, "It's okay. I'm not a threat." Thora snorted, tilting her head as she regarded him with something that almost felt like curiosity. Rin hesitated, then moved closer. His steps were slow, careful, his movements almost reverent as he approached the massive creature. When he was only a few feet away, Thora let out a low, rumbling sound, a sound of acknowledgement. Rin lowered his head slightly, his yellow eyes meeting hers as he let out a soft trill. It wasn't much, but it was his way of saying thank you. For a moment, they simply stood there, predator and prey, two creatures who should have been enemies but had somehow found something else. A fragile, unspoken trust. Over the next few days, the bond between Rin and Thora grew stronger. Thora never wandered far from the clearing, choosing instead to graze on the plants and ferns that grew nearby. Rin stayed close to her, though he was careful not to push his luck. He would rest in the shade of the trees while she grazed, watching her massive form move with a quiet strength that never failed to amaze him. Rin's injuries continued to heal, and he could feel his strength returning with each passing day. He began to test his movements, darting short distances and practicing his balance. His leg was still stiff, but it no longer held him back. Thora watched him closely, as though monitoring his progress. One afternoon, as Rin practiced leaping between fallen logs, Thora let out a loud snort, drawing his attention. Rin froze, his head snapping toward her as he watched her massive form shift slightly. She was looking at something, her gaze fixed on the trees at the edge of the clearing. Rin followed her gaze, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. For a moment he saw nothing. Then he heard it. A faint rustling sound, the same sound that had preceded the attack days before. Not again. Rin let out a sharp, warning trill, his body coiling with tension. Thora snorted in response, her horns lowering instinctively as she turned to face the threat. But this time, the danger wasn't another pack of raptors. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, far larger than anything Rin had seen before. It moved slowly, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground as it stepped into the clearing. The creature's thick, muscular body was covered in dark, scaly skin, and its head was crowned with massive jaws lined with teeth like daggers. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Rin's heart stopped. The T-Rex let out a deep, rumbling growl, its yellow eyes sweeping across the clearing as though assessing its prey. Rin froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his gaze flickered to Thora. She stood her ground, her horns lowered and her muscles coiled with tension, but even she seemed to recognize the danger. The T-Rex let out an earth-shaking roar, the sound reverberating through the clearing like thunder. Rin's claws dug into the dirt as he crouched low, his body trembling. He had faced danger before, but this was different. The T-Rex was a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable, and it was coming for them. Thora bellowed in response, her deep roar echoing through the clearing as she scraped her massive horns against the ground. She was ready to fight, but Rin knew it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. He had to do something. Rin's sharp eyes darted toward the jungle, searching for anything that might help. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of strategies he had learned during his time with his pack. Raptors didn't rely on strength. They relied on speed, agility, and cunning. And that's when it hit him. The T-Rex was powerful, but it was slow. If they could outmaneuver it, lead it away from the clearing, they might have a chance. Rin let out a sharp call, drawing Thora's attention. She turned her massive head toward him, her dark eyes narrowing as though asking, "What are you doing?" Rin chirped again, louder this time, before darting toward the edge of the clearing. He moved as quickly as his injured leg would allow, zigzagging between trees and ferns. The T-Rex's massive head swung toward him, its yellow eyes locking onto the smaller, faster prey. That's right, Rin thought. Come after me. The T-Rex let out another roar, its massive feet pounding the earth as it turned to pursue him. Rin darted through the jungle, his heart pounding in his chest as he heard the beast crashing through the underbrush behind him. Thora watched from the clearing, her horns still lowered. She let out a low, rumbling sound, a sound of hesitation, as though torn between following Rin and holding her ground. But Rin didn't look back. He couldn't. This was their only chance. Rin darted through the underbrush, his movements swift but fueled by desperation. The ground trembled beneath him, each thundering step of the T-Rex echoing like drumbeats through the forest. The predator was relentless, crashing through trees and snapping vines as it pursued the smaller Velociraptor with terrifying speed. Rin's breath came in sharp gasps, his body screaming in protest as he pushed himself harder and faster. His injured leg burned with each step, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every ounce of his energy was focused on one thing: leading the T-Rex away from Thora. The massive predator let out another earth-shaking roar, the sound reverberating through the jungle and sending flocks of startled birds into the air. Rin dared a glance over his shoulder and felt a chill crawl down his spine. The T-Rex was gaining ground, its massive jaws snapping as it plowed forward, crushing everything in its path. Think, Rin, think. He had no plan, no pack to back him up, no strength to fight back. All he had was his speed and his mind. And right now, that would have to be enough. Rin veered sharply to the right, darting through a cluster of tightly packed trees. The dense underbrush slowed the T-Rex down as it tried to follow, its massive form crashing into trunks and snapping branches. Rin weaved through the gaps, his smaller size allowing him to move effortlessly through spaces the T-Rex could never fit through. But the predator wasn't giving up. It snarled in frustration, forcing its way through the trees with brute strength. Rin could feel the ground tremble as it approached, and he knew he needed another plan. Fast. Up ahead, Rin spotted something. A steep ravine that cut through the jungle, its rocky walls hidden beneath a curtain of vines and ferns. The ravine was narrow, but it was deep, too deep for a creature as massive as the T-Rex to cross easily. If Rin could make it to the other side, he might have a chance. His claws dug into the earth as he pushed himself harder, the wind whipping past him as he sprinted toward the edge of the ravine. The T-Rex roared again, a sound of fury and hunger, as it followed close behind. Rin reached the edge and skidded to a stop, dirt and pebbles tumbling into the darkness below. He didn't hesitate. Coiling his muscles, Rin leapt forward, his body twisting midair as he cleared the gap. For a terrifying moment, he felt weightless, the roar of the T-Rex echoing behind him. Then he landed hard on the other side. His claws scrambled for purchase, and for a second it felt like he might slip. But Rin held on, dragging himself onto solid ground and collapsing onto his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The T-Rex skidded to a halt at the edge of the ravine, its massive claws sending dirt and rocks tumbling into the chasm. It let out a furious roar, its jaws snapping as it glared at Rin across the gap. The predator paced back and forth, searching for a way around, but the ravine was too wide. Rin let out a weak, triumphant chirp, his chest heaving. He had done it. But even as the T-Rex roared in frustration, Rin's thoughts turned back to Thora. He had led the predator away, but had it been enough? Was she safe? Gathering what little strength he had left, Rin pushed himself onto shaky legs and turned back toward the clearing. The clearing was silent when Rin returned, the jungle bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. The fight had left its mark. Broken branches and deep gouges in the earth told the story of the battle that had unfolded. Rin's sharp eyes darted around, searching desperately for Thora. Then he saw her. Thora stood near the center of the clearing, her massive body still and her head lowered slightly. Rin's heart sank as he noticed the deep scratches along her flank and the tired slump of her shoulders. She had fought and she had won, but the cost had been high. Rin chirped softly as he approached, his movements careful and deliberate. Thora's head lifted at the sound, her dark eyes locking onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thora let out a deep, rumbling sound, a soft, almost gentle noise that carried through the clearing. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something else. Relief. Rin stepped closer, his yellow eyes scanning her for signs of further injury. Thora snorted softly, her massive form relaxing as she watched him. Despite everything, despite the battle, the danger, and the exhaustion, they had both survived. Rin let out another quiet chirp, his body sinking into the grass as he sat near her. The jungle around them was still, as though holding its breath. It was a fragile moment, one of peace in a world that offered so little of it. Thora settled onto the ground beside him, her massive form sinking into the earth with a soft thud. For the first time in days, she seemed to rest, her dark eyes half closed as the golden light bathed her. Rin watched her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't explain. Gratitude, respect, friendship. Over the next few days, the clearing became their sanctuary. Thora's wounds healed slowly, the scratches along her flank scabbing over as her strength returned. Rin's leg grew stronger too, and he spent his days testing his movements, darting between trees, leaping over fallen logs, and practicing the agility he had once taken for granted. Thora watched him often, her calm gaze following his movements with quiet amusement. She seemed to understand what he was doing, that he was healing, rebuilding himself piece by piece. In return, Rin stayed close to her. He would chirp softly as she grazed, keeping watch for any signs of danger. It was an unspoken agreement, one that neither of them fully understood but both of them accepted. Predator and prey, together. One morning, Rin woke to the sound of distant thunder. The sky had turned gray, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon as the first drops of rain began to fall. The jungle grew dark, the wind whipping through the trees with an urgency that sent shivers up Rin's spine. Thora lifted her head, her massive form tense as she watched the sky. Rin chirped softly, his sharp eyes darting toward the trees. Something about the storm felt wrong. A low rumble shook the ground beneath them, followed by a distant crash. Rin froze, his instincts screaming at him to move. The ground is shifting. Thora bellowed suddenly, her massive form rising as the earth beneath her trembled. Rin leapt back, his claws digging into the dirt as cracks began to form in the clearing, spreading like veins across the ground. The storm had triggered something deep beneath the earth. A landslide. Rin screeched in warning, his body darting toward Thora as the ground beneath them buckled. Trees groaned and snapped, their roots tearing free as rocks and debris tumbled down from the hills. The clearing was no longer safe. Thora bellowed again, her horns slashing through the air as she turned toward the jungle, her massive feet pounding the earth. Rin followed close behind, his heart racing as the ground cracked and split behind them. The two of them ran side by side, Thora's massive form moving like a force of nature, Rin's smaller body darting through the underbrush with practiced speed. The sound of the landslide roared in their ears, the jungle collapsing behind them as they raced for safety. Rin's injured leg burned, but he pushed himself harder, matching Thora's pace as they wove through the trees. Up ahead, the forest opened into a wide stretch of land that sloped gently downward, a safer path away from the landslide. "Move!" Rin chirped sharply, his voice urgent. Thora let out a deep bellow, her powerful legs propelling her forward as they burst through the treeline. The ground shook violently behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Finally, they reached the open stretch of land, the roaring of the landslide fading into the distance as the storm settled. Thora slowed to a stop, her massive chest heaving as she turned to look back at the jungle. Rin stumbled to a halt beside her, his sides heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The clearing was gone. Where it had once stood, there was now a scar in the earth, a deep ravine carved out by the force of the landslide. Rin stared at it, his yellow eyes wide as he tried to process what had just happened. Thora let out a low, rumbling sound, her head lowering as though mourning the loss of their sanctuary. Rin chirped softly, stepping closer to her massive form. They had lost their home, but they had survived. Together, the storm had passed, leaving the jungle soaked and quiet in its wake. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and fresh rain, and droplets still clung to the leaves, sparkling faintly in the dappled sunlight. Rin and Thora stood side by side at the edge of the ravine, their bodies still and silent as they gazed at what had once been their clearing. Now the land was unrecognizable. A jagged scar cut deep into the earth, filled with broken branches, displaced rocks, and muddy pools of water. For a long time, neither of them moved. Rin let out a soft trill, his yellow eyes narrowing as he took it all in. That clearing had been their sanctuary, the one place in the chaotic jungle where they had felt safe. It had been where Rin had healed, where Thora had accepted him, where an unlikely bond had taken root and flourished. And now it was gone. Thora snorted softly, her head lowering as though she, too, felt the weight of the loss. Her massive form seemed smaller somehow, her broad shoulders slumping slightly as she turned away from the destruction. Rin watched her for a moment, his sharp eyes thoughtful. Thora had been his protector, his guide, and his unlikely ally. She had shown him kindness when she had no reason to, and now, for the first time, Rin realized something important. She needed him too. Without hesitation, Rin chirped softly and stepped forward. Thora paused, her dark eyes shifting to him as he approached. Rin tilted his head upward, meeting her gaze with quiet determination. "We'll find a new home," he seemed to say. "Together." Thora huffed in response, her massive horns lifting slightly as though she understood. There was a quiet resolve in the way she turned her massive form back toward the jungle. With a final glance at the ruined clearing, she let out a deep, rumbling call that echoed through the trees. Then they began to move. The journey was slow, but steady. Thora led the way, her massive form cutting through the dense underbrush like a living battering ram. Vines and ferns gave way beneath her feet, creating a path that Rin followed easily. He stayed close to her side, his sharp eyes scanning the trees and shadows for signs of danger. The jungle was still unpredictable. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sent a jolt of instinctual tension through Rin's body. He knew that predators still lurked in the shadows, watching and waiting for a moment of weakness. But Rin also knew they had an advantage. They were stronger together. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Rin began to notice something curious. Thora's movements had changed. She was slower, more deliberate, her head constantly turning as she searched for something, a destination. It was as though she knew where they were going, even if Rin didn't. The thought gave him hope. For days, they traveled through valleys and over hills, across muddy rivers and through towering groves of ancient trees. Rin's strength returned steadily with each passing day. His injured leg, though still stiff, no longer held him back. His movements grew quicker, his balance more sure. He would dart ahead of Thora, scouting the path before returning to her side with soft chirps of reassurance. Thora, in turn, seemed to trust him more. She no longer bristled when he darted too close or veered off the path. Instead, she would snort softly, her calm gaze following him until he returned. It was an unspoken rhythm they had developed, a silent understanding born of survival and trust. One afternoon, as the sun reached its peak in the sky, they stumbled upon something unexpected. The dense jungle suddenly gave way to an open clearing, vast, untouched, and bathed in golden light. The ground sloped gently downward, leading to a shallow river that meandered through the center of the valley. Towering trees lined the edges of the clearing, their thick branches creating a protective canopy of shade. Wildflowers dotted the grass, their bright colors standing out against the lush green. It was beautiful. Rin stepped forward, his yellow eyes wide as he took in the sight. It was quiet here, peaceful. No signs of predators, no broken earth or chaos. It felt untouched, as though the jungle itself had hidden this place away, waiting for them to find it. Thora let out a deep, contented rumble as she stepped into the clearing. Her massive feet sank into the soft earth, and for the first time in days, Rin saw her shoulders relax. She moved toward the river, lowering her head to drink deeply from the cool, clear water. Rin followed her, his sharp claws sinking into the soft mud as he approached the river's edge. He leaned down, lapping up the water eagerly. It was cold and fresh, washing away the dust and exhaustion of the journey. When he finished, Rin lifted his head and glanced toward Thora. She stood in the center of the clearing, her massive form framed by the sunlight. Her eyes were half closed, her posture calm and at ease. "We found it," Rin thought, his chest swelling with quiet pride. A new home. The days that followed were a time of peace. The clearing became their sanctuary, much like the first had been, but better. The river provided fresh water, the grass was plentiful for Thora to graze on, and the open space gave Rin room to move freely. Rin explored every corner of the valley, his movements confident and swift. His leg no longer pained him, and he took great satisfaction in testing his speed, darting through the grass, leaping over fallen logs, and scaling the lower branches of trees. Thora watched him often, her deep eyes following his movements with quiet amusement. She had begun to trust him completely, and Rin found himself trusting her in return. She was his protector, his constant, and his family in a way that no one else had been. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Rin perched on a low branch overlooking the clearing. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the clouds tinged with gold. Thora grazed nearby, her massive form casting long shadows across the grass. Rin watched her, his sharp yellow eyes thoughtful. He had come so far, survived so much. He had lost his pack, his strength, and nearly his life. And yet, somehow, he had found something better, a bond that defied nature itself. Thora lifted her head suddenly, her dark eyes locking onto his. Rin let out a soft chirp, tilting his head as he watched her. She snorted in response, a deep sound that seemed to echo through the clearing. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, predator and prey, allies and friends. And Rin realized something important. The jungle had changed them both. They were no longer enemies, no longer defined by the roles the world had given them. They had chosen something different, something stronger. Together, they had survived storms, predators, and the very earth breaking beneath them. And together, they would build a new life. Rin let out a soft trill, a sound of contentment that carried through the clearing. Thora huffed in response, lowering her head as though to acknowledge his call. The jungle around them was quiet, the air cool and still. It was a fragile piece, but it was theirs. And in that moment, Rin knew they would be all right. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in shadows as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Thora settled onto the grass, her massive form calm and still, while Rin curled up nearby, his sharp eyes half closed as he listened to the sounds of the jungle. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe, because in a world of chaos and danger, they had found each other. And that, Rin thought as he drifted off to sleep, changed everything.